The town didn't talk about Gideon Hale with cruelty. They talked about him with something worse, pity wrapped in polite smiles. Poor old Gideon, rattling around that ranch alone, stubborn as a fence post, twice as weathered. But nobody, not one soul in Redemption Flats, New Mexico, expected that on the worst night of the 1889 rainy season, a broken fence and a bleeding hand would unravel every careful wall that man had built around himself. And nobody expected Eliza Rowan to be the one who tore those walls down. She was 27 years old with calloused hands and opinions that made proper women flinch. He was 56 with a grief he'd never named out loud. The age gap alone was enough to set tongues wagging for a decade. But what came next? What the town did with their love, what it tried to do to them, that's the part nobody talks about. Until now. If you've ever been told your love was wrong simply because it didn't fit somebody else's picture of what love should look like, stay with me. Because this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel and follow every part of this story to the end. Because the next chapter is going to leave you speechless. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The fence had been failing for 3 days. Gideon Hale knew it the way old ranchers know everything. Not by looking directly at a problem, but by feeling it somewhere behind the sternum, a low, persistent ache that said something's wrong and you're ignoring it. He'd walked that north pasture line twice that week. The third post from the creek bend had shifted a good 6 inches in the saturated ground, and the wire was singing in a way wire only sings when it's about to let go entirely. He should have asked for help. Tomas, his part-time hand, had offered twice. "Mr. Hale, that ground's too soft. We wait 3 more days, maybe 4. It dries enough to—" "I've been setting fence posts since before your father was born," Gideon had said, not unkindly, but in the tone that ended conversations. Tomas had nodded and said nothing more. That was the thing about being the old man people respected. Nobody argued with you. They just let you make your mistakes in peace. So when the storm rolled in from the west on a Thursday evening in October, fast and black and indifferent, Gideon Hale did not go inside and sit by his stove like a sensible man. He pulled on his oilskin coat, picked up his lantern, and walked into the dark and the rain because that fence was not going to fix itself. And if it let go tonight, he'd lose half the north herd into the draw before morning. The rain came sideways. That was the first problem. It wasn't falling so much as being thrown. Great horizontal sheets of it that turned the lantern into a useless yellow blur and soaked through the oilskin at the collar within the first 100 yards. Gideon bent his head and kept walking. He'd been wet before. He'd been cold before. He'd been alone in the dark more times than he could count, and none of those things had killed him yet. He found the post exactly where he'd known it would be. Leaning at a sick angle, wire pulled taut against it like a man straining against a rope. The ground around the base was mud, deep and soft as batter, and when Gideon grabbed the post with both hands to test its remaining hold, he knew immediately it was worse than he'd thought. The wood shifted under his grip like something living, like it wanted to fall. He didn't hesitate. He went back for the tools he'd dragged out in a canvas sack, pulled out the tamping bar, and began to work. For 20 minutes, maybe 30, time does strange things in a bad storm. He managed. He got additional bracing wire around the neighboring posts, drove a temporary stake into the ground at a counter angle, and was just beginning to think he might actually get this done without calamity when the earth shifted beneath his left boot and he went down. Not a graceful stumble. A hard, ugly fall. One knee into the mud, both hands shooting out instinctively, and his right palm coming down directly onto the exposed end of a broken wire strand that had been curled back on itself like a fishhook. The pain was immediate and spectacular. He heard himself make a sound he was not proud of, something between a grunt and a curse, and jerked his hand back to find the wire had opened a gash across the meat of his palm and curled a secondary barb into the base of his index finger, deep enough that pulling it free required 3 tries, and left him breathing through his teeth in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. For a long moment he just knelt there in the mud with his ruined hand pressed against his chest, rain hammering the back of his neck, and thought very clearly, this was stupid. He bound the hand with his bandana as best he could one-handed, finished securing the post, because leaving it would have been worse somehow, a surrender he couldn't accept, and walked back to the house in the dark with the lantern in his left hand, his right arm bent against his body, and the particular silence of a man who had just done something he would never fully admit was a mistake. Inside, he lit the kitchen lamp and unwrapped the bandana. He'd seen worse injuries. He'd seen much worse, but the gash in his palm was deep enough to concern him, and the area around the barb wound was already showing a redness that spread slightly beyond the puncture itself, which was not a good sign in any decade, but was an especially bad sign in 1889, 30 miles from the nearest physician. He cleaned it with whiskey. He wrapped it in the cleanest cloth he could find. He sat down in his kitchen chair and told himself he'd be fine. He kept the lantern burning because the alternative, sitting alone in the dark with an injured hand and the sound of the storm, felt like something he wasn't willing to do. Eliza Rowan had not planned to be awake at that hour. She lived in a small house at the edge of the Caffrey property, about a mile and a half from Gideon's ranch, in an arrangement that suited both parties. The Caffreys got someone reliable on their land, and Eliza got enough distance from Redemption Flats' main street to breathe without feeling watched. She'd lived there since her father died 2 years ago, when she'd quietly taken over the informal work he'd done for frontier families who had no access to trained medicine. Cleaning wounds, setting simple fractures, managing fevers through their worst nights, talking women through difficult labors when the nearest doctor was a day's ride away. Nobody called her a healer. The word made people nervous in ways Eliza had stopped trying to understand. They called her capable. They called her handy. Old Mrs. Calder called her a godsend, but only whispered it, as if naming the thing too loud might make it disappear. What they did not call her, in any polite company, was available, because the unspoken consensus of Redemption Flats was that Eliza Rowan was precisely the kind of woman Dr. Owen Mercer ought to marry. She understood medicine, she was practical, she had no surviving family to complicate the arrangement, and at 27 she was reaching the age at which the town's sympathy for her independence would quietly convert itself into concern. Dr. Mercer himself had been circling this conclusion for the better part of a year. He was a decent man, Eliza thought, genuinely decent, which made the situation more complicated than if he'd been otherwise. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't condescending. He simply looked at her the way men look at sensible solutions to problems they have, with approval and with the quiet confidence of someone who hasn't yet been told no. She hadn't told him no. Not yet. She hadn't told him yes, either. She'd spent an extraordinary amount of energy not telling him anything at all. On the night of the storm, she'd been awake because she'd been awake a lot lately, lying in the dark and running calculations that never quite balanced. 32 years old when her father got sick, 25 when he died. 2 years since then, and she was no closer to understanding why the thought of building a life with a kind, steady, suitable man made her feel like she was standing in a room that had all the right furniture but none of the air. She got up to get water. She stood at the window while the storm made theater of itself outside, and that was when she saw it. A small, steady yellow light in the direction of Gideon Hale's north pasture, burning at a time when no sensible man would be working, burning low and patient through rain that should have extinguished it. She watched it for a long time. The light didn't move the way a working lantern moves. It sat still. It had the quality of something set down and not picked up again, and there was something about that stillness, in the middle of all that violent weather, that struck her as wrong in a way she couldn't immediately articulate. She got dressed. Later, when people asked her why ride out in a storm at that hour for a man you barely knew, she would never have a satisfying answer. She'd say something practical. I noticed the light was still. A working man moves his lantern, which was true, but wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was closer to something she'd learned sitting with sick people at 3 a.m. The ones who were in real trouble rarely called out. They went quiet. They sat with it. And if you waited for them to ask for help, sometimes you waited until it was too late. The ride to Gideon's ranch in that storm was not pleasant. Her horse, a sensible gray mare named Fern, moved with grudging cooperation and expressed her opinion of the weather through a series of hard, disapproving snorts. Eliza leaned low and let her pick her footing. She knocked on the ranch house door and waited. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. Mr. Hale. Eliza Rowan. I'm going to keep knocking until you open this door, so you may as well do it now. There was a long pause, long enough that she raised her fist for a third attempt, and then the latch lifted. Gideon Hale looked worse than she'd expected, and she'd expected something. He was in his shirt sleeves, his oilskin apparently abandoned somewhere, his right hand wrapped in what she recognized as a bandana with a worrying amount of color soaked through it. His face had the particular flatness of a man in significant pain who had decided pain was not a topic open for discussion. He looked at her with an expression she would later describe to no one, because there was no one she told things to. An expression that was equal parts surprise, something almost like relief, and the immediate suppression of both. "Miss Rowan," he said. His voice was steady. She gave him points for that. "It's past midnight." "I'm aware." "You rode out in this storm." "I did." "Why?" It wasn't really a question, or rather, it was a question, but not the kind that wanted an answer. It was the kind a man asks when he's trying to determine whether to be embarrassed or grateful and hasn't landed yet. "Because your lantern was still in the pasture at midnight," she said. "And a working man moves his lantern. Are you going to let me in, or are we going to do this in the doorway?" He stepped back. The kitchen was warm, which surprised her slightly. He'd kept the stove going, which meant some part of him had known he needed warmth, had made that concession, at least. The lamp on the table threw a yellow circle over everything, and she could see the whiskey bottle, the bloody cloth beside it, and the careful way he was holding his arm. "Let me see it," she said. "It's fine." She looked at him. Not a challenging look, just a steady, patient look that had ended more arguments than most weapons. "Mr. Hale, I rode 1.5 miles in a rainstorm at midnight. The least you can do is let me look at the hand." Something in him went quiet, just slightly. A small, almost imperceptible softening, like a door that's been jammed in its frame and has finally settled enough to move. He pulled the kitchen chair out from the table and sat down, and he held out his hand. It was worse than the whiskey and the cloth had suggested. The gash across the palm was clean enough. A wire cut usually was. But it was deep, and the puncture wound at the base of the finger was the real problem. The surrounding tissue was inflamed in a way that spoke of something beginning, some invisible argument between the wound and the body that hadn't yet been decided. "You cleaned this with whiskey," she said. "I did." "When?" "Hour ago, maybe 2. She pressed gently at the edge of the inflammation. He didn't make a sound, but his other hand gripped the edge of the table, and she noted that. "The puncture's concerning," she said. "Not the cuts. The cut's manageable. But this—" She touched the redness carefully. "This needs proper drawing and watching. If this turns septic, you're looking at a serious problem." "I've had worse." "I know you have," she said, and meant it without condescension. "That's not the same as saying this one isn't worth treating." She'd brought her bag. She always brought her bag when something felt like she should bring her bag. She unpacked what she needed onto his table: poultice materials, clean cloth, the small bottle of carbolic solution she'd gotten from Dr. Mercer's office 6 months ago and rationed carefully ever since. And she worked in a silence that was not uncomfortable exactly, but was conscious. Both of them were aware of it. Gideon watched her hands. She could feel him watching, not in any improper way, but with the attention of a man who had been self-sufficient so long that watching someone else take competent care of a problem felt like something between relief and disconcertion. "You don't have to stay," he said, when she began wrapping the final dressing. "I know." "It's late." "You mentioned." "Your reputation—" She stopped what she was doing and looked at him directly. "Mr. Hale, my reputation in this town is built on showing up at inconvenient hours to help people who think they don't need help. I don't believe this is going to damage it significantly." He was quiet for a moment. Then, and she would think about this later, would think about it more than made sense, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly, but the ghost of something that might have been one, if ghosts were in the habit of looking exhausted, grudgingly amused. "Fair enough," he said. She finished the dressing. She told him what to watch for, what would be normal over the next 2 days, and what would mean he needed to stop being stubborn and send someone for her. She told him to keep the hand elevated while he slept and to change the outer cloth in the morning. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which she appreciated. Most men interrupted. "I'll come back tomorrow to check it," she said, packing her bag. "You don't?" "I know I don't have to. I'm coming anyway." She looked at him. "Unless you'd prefer to handle this with more whiskey and stubbornness?" He said nothing, which she took, correctly, as agreement. She rode home in the rain, which had gentled somewhat, just a steady falling now without the anger behind it. She tried to organize her thoughts into something sensible and found they weren't particularly interested in being organized. She thought about his hand. She thought about the careful way he'd held it before she arrived, managing the pain in private. She thought about the kitchen that was warm because some part of him, underneath all that self-sufficiency, understood that warmth mattered. She thought about the ghost of a smile. "Stop it," she told herself with the firmness she used for patients trying to do too much too soon. She got home. She changed into dry clothes. She lay in the dark and listened to the rain find its rhythm on the roof above her. She told herself she was thinking about the wound, the inflammation, the need for a follow-up tomorrow. She almost believed it. What? The next morning, Redemption Flats woke to clear skies and muddy streets, and the particular fresh smell that comes after a serious storm, that clean, almost painful brightness of a world that has been wrung out. People emerged to assess damage, count losses, compare stories about the night. Martha Healy, who operated the town's only boarding house and functioned as its primary information exchange, had already heard from two separate sources that Eliza Rowan's horse had been seen leaving in the direction of the Hale Ranch sometime close to midnight. She filed this information away with the careful patience of a woman who understood that the best stories weren't the ones that broke fast. They were the ones you held until they were ready. She did mention it to her sister, of course, just in passing. Gideon's hand, when Eliza returned the following afternoon, had not worsened. This was the best news available. Not that it was better, but that it hadn't gotten worse, which in infection was sometimes the most you could hope for in the first day. He'd changed the outer cloth. He'd kept it elevated. He'd done exactly what she told him, which surprised her enough that she actually said so. "You followed the instructions," she said somewhat plainly. "I follow good instructions," he said. "Most men argue first. Most men are idiots about their hands." He said it without heat, just as a fact. "I've watched a man lose 2 fingers to a wound smaller than this because he decided he knew better than the person treating him. I don't need to repeat someone else's mistake to learn from it." She looked at him. He was sitting at the same kitchen table in the same chair, and there was something about the quality of the afternoon light in that room, the way it came in at an angle through the west window and landed on everything, that made the space feel different from how it had seemed at midnight, less like emergency, more like somewhere people might actually talk to each other. "That's unusual thinking," she said. "Is it? For a man who wouldn't send for help in the first place." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a different problem," he said finally. "Sending for help requires admitting you need it before the evidence makes it undeniable. That's the part I'm bad at. Once I know I need it," he paused, looked at his wrapped hand. "Once I know, I can manage the rest." It was more honesty than she'd expected, more self-awareness than she was used to from men his age, from men any age, really. That particular ability to name your own fault without excusing it. "That's a useful thing to know about yourself," she said carefully. "Took me about 50 years to figure it out," he said. "Shouldn't have taken that long." She changed the dressing. The inflammation was holding, not retreating yet, but not advancing either, which meant the treatment was doing its work. She applied a fresh poultice, wrapped the hand properly, told him the same things she'd said yesterday, plus 2 or 3 additional observations that the daylight and the improved condition made possible. She stayed longer than strictly necessary. She didn't realize she'd done it until she was back on Fern, halfway to the Caffrey property, and the afternoon had gone soft and golden around her. She tried to reconstruct the conversation and found she couldn't account for the time. They talked about the storm. They talked about the North herd, which he was worried about, and she'd asked questions that turned out not to be polite questions, but actual questions, because she'd found herself wanting to understand how a cattle operation actually worked, and he'd explained it in a way that was direct and detailed and not at all adjusted for what he assumed she'd want to hear. They talked about her father briefly. He'd asked how long Martin Rowan had been doing the work Eliza now did, and she'd said 20 years, and he'd said he was a good man in a way that made it plain he'd known her father and meant it specifically. She'd said thank you and felt it. She got home in the gold of late afternoon and stood in her own doorway for a moment, watching the light move through her small, tidy rooms, and tried to understand why everything felt slightly different than it had the morning before. She couldn't find the answer, and that bothered her more than she wanted to admit. 3 blocks away, in the sitting room of the boarding house, Martha Healy was telling her sister, with considerable detail and only slight embellishment, that Eliza Rowan had now visited Gideon Hale's ranch twice in 24 hours. The sister said, "Well?" Martha said, "Exactly." And somewhere in the kitchen of a ranch house that had been quiet for too long, Gideon Hale sat with his injured hand wrapped against his chest and thought about a woman who asked real questions and about the particular silence that exists in a room after someone decent has left it. He didn't call it anything, but he sat with it for a long time before he got up to start the evening's war. By the 4th visit, Eliza stopped pretending she was coming only for the hand. She told herself it was professional diligence. The inflammation had been slow to retreat, not alarmingly slow, but slow enough that twice-daily checks were medically defensible. And she was a person who liked her actions to be defensible, who liked to be able to point at a reason and say, "There, that's why." The reason was the wound. The wound was her business. She was a woman who took her business seriously. That was what she told herself on the ride over. Then she'd get there and Gideon would already have the coffee on. Not because he'd known exactly when she was coming, but because she gradually understood he kept it on now in a general way, the way a person does when they've started expecting something. And they would sit at his kitchen table while she checked the dressing, and then they would keep sitting long after the dressing was checked, and the coffee would go from hot to warm to cool, and neither of them would notice until the light changed. On the 4th day, she noticed that he'd swept the kitchen. It wasn't a dramatic thing. The kitchen had been functional before. A working man's kitchen, clean enough but purposeful, every surface holding something that needed to be there. But on the 4th day, there was a small, clear space on the windowsill where a collection of harness hardware had been, and the floor had that slightly damp quality of wood recently mopped. And Eliza looked at these things and then looked carefully at her coffee cup to avoid looking at Gideon's face. "How's the movement today?" she asked in her professional voice. "Better," he said. "I can close the fist about 3/4. "Let me see." He showed her. She took his hand in both of hers, which she'd done a dozen times now, and which had stopped producing any particular reaction in either of them, or rather, had stopped producing any reaction either of them acknowledged. And she worked the fingers gently, checking the flexibility of the healing tissue, the give of the new skin beginning to close over the gash. "Another week," she said. "Maybe 10 days before you should use it for heavy work." "That long? You want to argue about it?" "No," he said. And then after a pause, "I was thinking it was a reasonable estimate." She released his hand. She picked up her coffee. The morning had that specific October quality. Cold outside, warm where the stove was, that narrow band of comfort that existed only right there in that kitchen at that particular hour. "You swept," she said. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. He was quiet for a moment. She kept her eyes on her coffee. "The floor needed it," he said. Another pause. Longer. "Eliza." He almost never used her given name. He'd used it twice before, once on the 2nd day when she'd been crouched over her bag with her back to him, and once yesterday when she'd nearly walked into the porch post because she was watching a hawk. Both times it had come out as if he'd said it before he'd decided to. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know you can tell me it's none of my business." She turned to look at him then. His face was doing that thing it did when he was being careful, not closed exactly, but deliberate, like a man taking his time to find level ground before he sets something down on it. "Ask," she said. "Dr. Mercer." He stopped. Are you and he—" "No," she said. Too fast, probably. She didn't care. "No, we are not anything. The town seems to think otherwise. The town thinks a great many things that have very little to do with what's actually happening." She set her cup down. Owen Mercer is a decent man who has been working up to asking me a question I've been working very hard not to be present for. That's the full extent of it. Gideon looked at her steadily. Why are you avoiding his question? Because once he asks it, I'll have to answer it, and the answer is no. And then I'll have to watch him understand that, and he'll be kind about it, because he's a kind man, and that's somehow worse than if he were otherwise. She shook her head. I'm not looking forward to that conversation. No, Gideon said. I don't imagine you are. The kitchen was quiet. Someone's horse shifted in the yard outside. The stove ticked. Why no? He asked. Just that. Quiet and direct, and with none of the judgment she'd been bracing for. She looked at the window, the clear space on the windowsill where the harness hardware had been. Because I can sit in a room with him for 2 hours and then stand up and feel exactly the same as when I sat down. And I don't think that's what a life together is supposed to feel like. She paused. I don't think it's fair to him. And I don't think it's fair to me. Gideon said nothing for a long moment. Then, no, it isn't. She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup. Your wife, she said carefully. She'd been careful with this the whole week. It was the shape she felt in every conversation, the absence that structured things, the room in the house nobody opened. Will you tell me about her? He was quiet long enough that she thought she'd gone too far. Then he said, Catherine. Her name was Catherine. She died 11 years ago. A pause. Fever. 3 days start to finish, which is a mercy in its way, or that's what I told myself. Did it help, telling yourself that? No, he said. But I kept doing it anyway. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. She laughed at things I said. That sounds like a small thing. It wasn't a small thing. She'd laugh at something I said, and I'd think, I said that right. I got that right. After she was gone, I never quite knew if I was getting things right anymore. There was nobody to... He stopped. Tell you? Eliza said softly. Yeah. She understood that. Understood it in the specific bone-deep way she understood it because she'd had the same thing with her father. Not a husband, but a person who told her by their reactions whether she was moving right through the world, whether what she'd done was worth doing, whether the day had added up to something. When Martin Rowan died, she'd lost her North Star and hadn't figured out yet how to navigate without it. She almost said so. She stopped herself and instead said, She sounds like she was worth missing. Gideon looked at her. She was, he said. She really was. It wasn't the last time they talked about Catherine. But it was the first time, and it had the quality of a door opened carefully, not thrown wide, just moved enough to let the air through. And when Eliza rode home that afternoon, she thought that this was possibly the most honest conversation she'd had with another person in 2 years, and that it had happened with a man she'd met less than a week ago over a wound that was already closing. She didn't know what to do with that. She suspected she'd figure it out. So, on the 5th day, she arrived to find Gideon's nearest neighbor, a heavy-set woman named June Pratt, standing in the yard with her arms crossed and her face arranged in the expression of someone who has appointed herself to a task she finds unpleasant, but necessary. June Pratt was not a cruel woman. Eliza had treated her youngest son's broken arm the previous winter, and June had been grateful, genuinely, warmly grateful, had brought food for a week afterward. But June Pratt was also a woman who lived inside the boundaries of what was considered appropriate with the specific passion of someone who had never seriously examined whether those boundaries made sense, only that they were there, and crossing them made things complicated. Eliza, June said when Eliza dismounted. I was hoping to catch you. Good morning, June. I'm going to say something, and I hope you'll hear it as concern because that's what it is. Eliza kept her expression neutral. All right. People are talking. June said it like she was reporting weather, regretful but factual. About you coming here every day. About what it looks like. And I know you're treating his hand. I know that's what it is, but Eliza, honey, the way things look matters out here. You know that. I do, Eliza said. I also know that when John Ridley had that infected leg last spring, I came to his ranch 6 days in a row, and nobody felt the need to mention how it looked. June's mouth opened and then closed. That's
John Ridley is 63 years old and married. He's also a man, Eliza said, which is the relevant distinction, and I think you know that. June had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. I'm not saying it's fair. I know you're not.
And she meant it. She wasn't angry at June, not exactly. June was the water, not the riverbank. But the hand needs treating, June, and I'm the person who's treating it. If that produces gossip, that's the town's problem to manage, not mine. She went inside. Gideon was at the kitchen table. He'd clearly heard some portion of the conversation. His windows were not thick, and June Pratt's voice carried. His expression when she came through the door had an apology in it that he hadn't said out loud yet. You don't have to, he started. If you tell me I don't have to come back, she said, setting her bag down, I'm going to be annoyed with you. Is that what you want? A beat. No. Then let me look at the hand. He held it out. She worked in the silence for a moment, checking the progress. And it was good. Genuinely good. The skin closing cleanly, the inflammation retreating, the wound doing what wounds were supposed to do when they were treated properly. She should have felt only satisfaction about this. She was aware that she felt something else alongside it, something that had more to do with the fact that healing hands meant fewer reasons to keep coming, and she was aware that this was a problem she would have to deal with honestly at some point soon. She's not wrong, Gideon said. June. About the talk. She's not wrong that it's happening, Eliza agreed. She's wrong that it's a reason for me to stop. He looked at her. People will say things about you. People already say things about me. They say I'm too independent, too attached to my father's work, too particular about my opinions. She tied off the fresh dressing with more precision than strictly required. I've been too much of something or other my entire adult life, Gideon. I stopped changing my behavior to manage it, and things got considerably easier. He was quiet. Then, the age, stop. She said it gently, but she said it. I know what you're about to say, and I'd like you to not say it yet. Can you do that? Something moved through his face. Surprise, she thought, and then something softer. Yeah, he said. I can do that. Good. She stayed 2 hours. They talked about the North Herd again and about a dispute he was having with the county over a water rights question that had been unresolved for 3 years, and she offered an opinion that surprised him. Not because it was wrong, but because she understood the legal dimension of it better than he'd expected. And he told her so. And she told him her father had handled similar questions for 3 different ranching families, and she'd been present for most of the discussions. You learned a lot from him, Gideon said. He taught me everything I know, and about half of what I think, she said. The other half I had to figure out the hard way. What's the hard way half? She considered this honestly. That being right about something doesn't mean people will thank you for it. That grief doesn't have a schedule, that... She paused. That waiting for someone to be ready is sometimes patience and sometimes cowardice, and it's not always easy to tell the difference. Gideon was very still. Which is it right now? He asked. His voice was quiet, level. She met his eyes. I'm not sure yet, she said, but I'm thinking about it. The week turned. The hand continued to heal. Eliza continued to come. She stopped counting the visits after the 8th one because counting felt like the wrong way to think about it, like measuring something that wasn't supposed to be measured, that would change its nature if you put numbers on it. She came because there was something in that kitchen, in the quality of the conversation, in the specific way Gideon Hale listened when she talked, not waiting for his turn, but actually listening. The way you listen when what someone is saying matters to you, that she hadn't found anywhere else. She knew this was significant. She was not a woman who failed to notice significant things. What she was afraid. Not of him, not of the feeling itself, afraid of the architecture of it, of what it would require, of what it would cost, of the particular arithmetic of loving someone you might not get to keep long enough. She'd done that arithmetic once with her father, and arrived at a number that had taken 2 years to stop hurting. She didn't know if she could do it again. Gideon, for his part, said nothing that could be called a declaration. He was careful in a way she recognized as intentional, not pulling back, but not advancing either, giving her space she hadn't asked for, but that she found herself grateful for anyway. He treated her like someone whose judgment he trusted and whose time was valuable. And in the context of Redemption Flats in 1889, this was more radical than it might sound. Dr. Owen Mercer managed to catch her on a Tuesday. She was coming out of the Caffrey barn when he appeared on the path, and there was something about his posture, straight-backed, prepared, that told her immediately he'd thought about this approach, had chosen the location and the timing deliberately. She gave him credit for that, at least. "Eliza," he said, "do you have a few minutes?" She thought very briefly about claiming she didn't. She decided that was worse. "Of course," she said. He was a good-looking man, Owen Mercer. Not striking, but clean-featured and young, with the particular confidence of someone who had been told since childhood that they were destined for something respectable and had not yet encountered serious evidence to the contrary. He was 29 years old, and he genuinely cared about his patients, and he was going to be a good doctor for this town for a long time. She believed all of that. She also believed, with a clarity that surprised her by its completeness, that none of it was for her. "I think you know what I want to ask you," he said. "I think I do. I want to ask if you'd consider—" He paused, gathered. "I think we would make a good partnership, Eliza. Your practical knowledge and my training. We could build something real here." Partnership. She noted the word. Not love, not feeling, not the particular chaos of two people who couldn't stop talking to each other at kitchen tables at hours when they should be elsewhere. Partnership. It was an honest word, she supposed. It described what he was offering accurately. "Owen," she said, "you're a good man. I mean that without reservation." His face shifted, slightly, just a preparation for something. But what you're describing, what you want, I don't think I'm the right person to build it with you." He looked at her for a long moment. "Because of Hale," he said. It wasn't a question. Eliza didn't flinch. "Because of me," she said. "Gideon Hale is a separate thing." Which was true, and wasn't the whole truth, and she thought Owen was probably smart enough to know both of those things. He was quiet. There was something working through his face. Disappointment, she thought, but not the devastation of a man who had truly expected a different answer. He'd known, perhaps, and had asked anyway because leaving the question unasked was its own kind of cost. "He's 30 years older than you," Owen said finally. Not cruelly, just as a fact he felt needed to be on the table. "I'm aware. People will—" "I know what people will do," she said quietly. "I'm aware of all of it, Owen. I've thought about all of it." She looked at him steadily. "That doesn't change what I know." He looked away. Out at the Caffrey land, at the hills going brown with the end of the season, at something that probably wasn't the hills. "He's a good man," Owen said at last, and she heard what that cost him. Not the words themselves, but the honesty of them. "I don't like it, but he's a good man." "He is," she said. Owen Mercer nodded. Once, carefully, like a man accepting an outcome he couldn't argue his way out of. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said. "I almost never do," she told him, "but I'm going to do it anyway." She didn't tell Gideon about the conversation with Owen, not that day, not the next. She held it privately for several days, thinking it through. Not the outcome, which was clear, but the fact of it. That she'd said what she'd said out loud to another person. That she'd named, even obliquely, what was happening. That saying it hadn't felt like a mistake. What she did do, on the Friday of the second week, was arrive at the ranch and find Gideon in the yard, splitting wood one-handed, which was exactly as reckless as it sounds. And she stood at the gate for a moment, watching him do it, before she said, in the quietest voice that could still be considered firm, "If you split that wound open, I will have very few kind things to say to you." He stopped. He had the grace to look like a man who knows he's been caught. "The wood can wait," she said. "Come here." He came. She checked the hand. It had held barely, the exertion having stressed the healing tissue but not torn it, and she said nothing while she worked except the things that were medically relevant. And when she finished, she held his hand for a moment longer than necessary, and he let her, and they were both very aware of it.
"I'm not good at waiting," he said. "I never have been." "I know," she said. "Eliza." Her name in his voice. She'd noticed she'd started listening for it. "I need to say something, and I need you to not stop me this time." She released his hand. She looked at him. "I'm 56 years old," he said. "I know what I look like to this town. I know what I look like to you, maybe. An old man rattling around a ranch who doesn't have the sense to stay out of storms." He stopped, breathed. "But when you're here, He looked away, at the yard, at something.
I remember things I'd stopped expecting to feel. And I'm not going to pretend I don't, because I've been pretending things were fine for 11 years and I'm done with it. I'm too old to keep doing that. The yard was very quiet. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said. "I don't want you to think I'm—" "Gideon." She said his name the way he said hers, before she'd decided to. "I'm not afraid of what you're asking. I'm afraid of what I'm answering." He turned to look at her then. His face was open in a way she hadn't seen it before. Not the careful, deliberate face he wore in public, not the managed expression of a man who'd learned to keep things internal. Just open, a little raw. The face of a person who has said the true thing and is waiting. "My father was the most important person in my life," she said, "and I watched him die by inches over 8 months, and I held his hand at the end, and I thought—" She stopped, steadied herself. "I thought never again. I thought I could not survive doing that again, building something with someone, and then losing it," Gideon said. He said it softly. "Yeah. But," she looked at him, "but I'm standing here and I'm talking to you, and I have been standing here, and I have been talking to you for 2 weeks, and I can't—" She exhaled. "I can't figure out how to stop." The air between them had the quality of something held in suspension. Not broken, not resolved, just present, just existing in the space between two people who have said enough true things that the next silence means something. "I'm not going anywhere," Gideon said finally. "I know that's not a guarantee. I know nothing is." He held her gaze. "But I'm not going anywhere on purpose, and I'd like it very much if you kept coming here. Not for the hand. The hand is fine." A pause. "For whatever this is." For whatever this is, she thought about that for a long time, even standing there, even while everything in her that was afraid pulled in one direction, and everything that recognized something true pulled in the other. "All right," she said at last, "for whatever this is." She stayed until the light went flat and the stars began to suggest themselves, faint and tentative in the east. She rode home in the dark, which she never usually did, and Fern was calm and certain in the dark, in the way reliable animals are, and Eliza let the reins go easy and looked at the sky and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly, something quieter, something that had more to do with direction than with feeling, with knowing, finally, which way she was pointing, even if the ground ahead wasn't entirely visible. In the house she'd left behind, Gideon Hale sat on his porch in the cold and watched the stars come out one at a time and did not feel alone for the first time in 11 years. He knew what was coming, not the details. The details were still over the horizon, but the shape of it, the fact of it. He also knew the town was not going to be quiet about this. He thought about June Pratt's crossed arms in the yard. He thought about the way people in small places had of making something private into a referendum, of deciding that what happened between two people in a kitchen was actually everyone's business, everyone's to assess and discuss and decide the value of. He'd lived in Redemption Flats for 23 years. He knew exactly how it was going to go. He sat with that knowledge for a while in the dark and the cold, and he held it up against the other thing, against the sound of Eliza's voice saying, "For whatever this is," against the specific weight of an afternoon that had felt, for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember, like something worth having. He went inside. He made sure the stove was banked properly. He checked the lock on the door out of old habit. Then he went to bed, and for once, slept without dreaming of the things that weren't there anymore. The town, as it happened, had already started talking. Martha Healy had told her sister had told the women's auxiliary of the church. The Women's Auxiliary had the particular efficiency of a group that has long practice moving information from one end of a community to the other. And by Thursday of the following week, a version of the story, enlarged in some places, shrunken in others, rearranged in ways that suited the teller, had reached essentially every household in Redemption Flats. What they were saying ranged from merely speculative to genuinely mean, and the genuinely mean part had located, with the precision that gossip always manages, the exact points of vulnerability: her age, his age, the difference between them, the impropriety of her visits, the question of what a woman her age was thinking, the question of what a man his age was thinking, and most pointed of all, the suggestion, spoken quietly but spoken, that perhaps Eliza Rowan, who had no family money and no husband and a precarious kind of independence that depended entirely on people's goodwill, was making a very calculated decision about a very solvent ranch. Eliza heard this last piece through a patient, a woman named Frances Dole, who told her with the specific discomfort of someone delivering news they believe the recipient deserves to have, regardless of how painful it is. Eliza thanked her. She finished treating Frances's daughter's earache. She rode to the Caffrey property and sat in her small house for an hour without lighting the lamp. She wasn't crying. She wasn't quite angry. She was doing something more exhausting than either of those things, which was trying to decide if what people were saying about her had changed anything. If the thing people were calling her changed the thing she actually was. If the story the town was telling about her intentions was more true than the story she knew about them from the inside. After an hour, she concluded, No, it hadn't changed anything. She lit the lamp and cooked her supper and thought about what it would actually cost her to walk forward into this. The social cost, the daily friction of being the subject of the town's concern, the particular loneliness of being talked about by people who meant you well and reached the wrong conclusions. She held all of that honestly and didn't minimize it. Then she thought about the kitchen, about the coffee gone cool, about the clear space on the windowsill where the harness hardware used to be. She thought about the sound of his voice saying her name before he'd decided to. She put the thought of the town's opinion in one hand and the weight of that kitchen in the other, and she held them there and looked at them clearly, and the scale was not even close. She washed her supper dish. She went to bed. She was back at the Hale Ranch the next morning before the coffee had finished. The pressure arrived the way most pressure does. Not all at once, but in increments, each one small enough to dismiss until suddenly you were standing under the weight of all of them at once and wondering when exactly that had happened. It started with looks. The particular kind that slide away when you meet them, not hostile enough to confront, not friendly enough to ignore. Eliza noticed them at the feed store, at the dry goods counter, in the brief exchanges that constituted social life on a frontier street. People were polite. People in small places are almost always polite, which is how they manage to make you feel terrible without ever saying anything you could reasonably object to. Then it progressed to the things said within her hearing that were technically not said to her. A comment about the weather segueing into something about how young women made unwise decisions in isolation. A remark about the Hale Ranch that ended just before it became a remark about her. The studied pause, the redirected sentence, the smile that had something behind it she wasn't meant to name out loud. And then, one morning in the third week of November, her sister arrived. Clara Rowan. Clara Briggs now, 3 years married to a cattleman in the next county over, did not give advance notice of her visit. This was itself a statement. Clara was a woman who understood the rhetoric of gesture, who knew that arriving unannounced was its own kind of argument, the kind that starts before anyone has opened their mouth. She was sitting in Eliza's small house when Eliza got home from the Hale Ranch, which meant she'd been waiting, which meant she'd been there long enough to form opinions about the state of the house, the hour, and everything she imagined those things to mean. "You look different," Clara said, as Eliza came through the door. "Good afternoon to you too," Eliza said, and hung her coat. Clara was 2 years older, which she'd always treated as a kind of authority. She had their father's dark eyes and their mother's practical mouth, and an expression right now that Eliza recognized as the face of a woman who has rehearsed a conversation and is deciding whether to use the version she practiced or the one she actually means. "I heard things," Clara said. "I came to hear them from you." Eliza put the kettle on. She kept her back to her sister for a moment. "What things?" "You know what things."
I'd like to hear your version. She turned around. So I know which version is circulating. Clara's jaw tightened. Eliza. He is 30 years older than you. 29, Eliza said. People keep rounding up. That is not the point. I know it isn't. What is the point, Clara? Say it plainly. Her sister stood up, which she did when she needed to feel like she had the physical advantage of a conversation, a habit she'd had since childhood. The point is that people are saying you've lost your senses, that you're attaching yourself to an old man because you're lonely and frightened and you don't know what else to do, that you're wasting yourself. The kettle was heating. Eliza could hear it beginning to work. Is that what you think? I think you're 27 years old and you've been alone since Papa died and you're confusing. Don't. Eliza said it the same way she'd said it to Gideon weeks ago. Not with anger, but with the particular firmness of someone who knows exactly where the line is. Don't explain my feelings to me, Clara. You don't know them. Then explain them to me. She poured the water.
She brought 2 cups to the table. She sat down and looked at her sister and tried to find the words that would be honest without being weaponized, because that was always the challenge with Clara. Not that she was cruel, but that she was smart enough to take true things and use them in ways they hadn't been meant. When I'm with him, Eliza said carefully, I don't feel like I'm disappearing. She stopped, tried again. With Owen, with the idea of Owen, I could see the whole life laid out in front of me. Very clearly, very correctly. And in that clear, correct picture, I couldn't find myself. I couldn't find any version of me that was still me. She looked at her cup. With Gideon, I don't know what the picture looks like, but I'm in it. I can feel that I'm in it. Clara was quiet for a long moment. That's not a practical basis for a life, she said finally, but her voice had lost some of its edge. I know. He's going to be old, Eliza. He's going to need care. You're going to spend your best years taking care of someone I love? Eliza looked at her sister. Is that so different from what you'd have me do? Take care of a household I don't love because the arithmetic is better? Clara looked away. Out the window. The sky was doing that winter thing. Not quite stormy, not quite clear, just a uniform gray that went on in every direction. Mama would have said something, Clara said at last. Mama would have said something about everything, Eliza replied. She had opinions about the way I laced my boots. That doesn't mean she was right. Papa would have liked him, Clara said. She said it quietly, almost to herself. Eliza stopped. What? Clara turned back from the window. I said Papa would have liked him. I met Gideon Hale once, years ago, at a town meeting. He was one of 3 men who actually listened when Papa was speaking, not waiting for their turn. Actually, listening. A pause. I remembered that. The kitchen held them both for a moment. I don't want you to get hurt, Clara said. She sounded suddenly much less like a rehearsed argument and much more like a sister. That's what it is. That's all it is. I know, Eliza said, and more gently, I know that's all it is. Clara drank her tea. She did not give her blessing. That wasn't a thing Clara was built to do easily. But she stayed for 2 hours, and when she left there was no longer an argument between them, just the ordinary, complicated weather of 2 sisters who love each other in the way family loves, imperfectly, with conditions, with history, but without question. Eliza stood in the doorway and watched her go, and then went back inside and sat with the specific quiet of a house where something difficult has just passed through and left it cleaner. She thought about what Clara had said. Papa would have liked him. She held that for a long time. Gideon heard about the visit from Tomas, who heard it from the feed store, because in Redemption Flats information moved the way water moved. It found every available channel and ended up everywhere eventually. He didn't bring it up directly. Instead, the next time Eliza came, which was 2 days later, on a Wednesday when the cold had properly settled in and the ranch had that first frost stillness to it, he watched her face when she came through the door, reading it the way he'd learned to read weather, looking for the indicators that told you what was actually happening underneath the surface presentation. She looked tired. Not defeated, he'd learned the difference in her face, but the specific fatigue of someone who has been defending something and is tired of the defending even though they haven't stopped. He waited until the coffee was poured. Then, "You all right?" Clara came. "I know." She looked at him. "Of course you know." Not bitter, just recognizing the reality of living in a place that small. "What did you hear?" "That she came. That she left." He paused. "That it didn't look like either of you were destroyed by it." "That's more or less accurate." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "She's not wrong about the practical things, Gideon. I'm not going to pretend she is. The math is what it is. The things people are saying about it are going to keep being said." "Yeah," he said. I need you to know that I know all of that. That I'm not walking into this with my eyes closed." She looked at him steadily. "I need you to know it so you can't decide later that you were protecting me from something I didn't understand." He was quiet for a long moment. "I wasn't planning to." "Good. But I want to say one thing." He set his cup down. "I've been thinking about the practical things too, about what this looks like from the outside and what it means for you specifically. Not for me. I've had a life. I've done the things a person does. You're 27 years old, and what I'm asking you to step into it has a cost. I know it has a cost, and I want you to know that I know that. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't." Eliza looked at him for a long time. "You're not asking me anything," she said carefully. "Not yet." "No," he agreed. "Not yet." The distinction mattered. Both of them understood why. Not yet was honest. Not yet meant something was coming, meant the ground ahead existed even if it wasn't visible from here, and the knowing of it was enough for now. Was more, actually, than most people offered. She stayed until dark. This had become normal. Neither of them had said it was normal. It had simply become that, the way certain things do when you stop fighting them. Gideon walked her out to where Fern was waiting, patient and unimpressed by the cold the way old, reliable horses are. He helped her mount, not because she needed it, but because they were both at a point where the brief contact of something as simple as that had a weight they were willing to acknowledge, and he held the reins while she settled, and then he held them a moment past when he needed to. 3 weeks ago, he said, looking up at her, I was sitting in this yard in the mud with a bleeding hand trying to convince myself I was fine. You were very convincingly not fine, she said. The worst part is I believed myself. She looked down at him. The dark was full around them, and the cold was genuine, and she was warmly dressed, and he was not, standing there in the yard with his breath making small clouds, and the whole scene had the quality of something that would last in memory. The specific textures of it, the cold and the dark, and the patient horse, and the man standing in the yard looking up at her. I'll be back Thursday, she said. I know, he said. She turned Fern toward home. He stood in the yard until the sound of hooves faded entirely, and then he went back inside, and the kitchen had the trace of her in it still. The 2 cups, the smell of coffee, the chair not pushed fully back to the table. He left it exactly as it was. December arrived and brought the real cold with it, the kind that cracked wood and stiffened hinges and made the mornings a negotiation between the body and the temperature before anything else could happen. Eliza moved between the Caffrey property and the Hale Ranch with a regularity that had stopped being remarkable to her personally and had become instead a fixed point. One of the things she knew about her days, the way she knew the direction of the wind and the sound the Caffrey house made when the temperature dropped past a certain point. What was remarkable was what she found happening in the workshop behind Gideon's barn. She noticed it first by accident, coming around the south side of the house one morning and catching, through the workshop's high window, the glow of a lamp at an hour when Gideon was usually already out on the range. She didn't say anything. She filed it alongside the other small mysteries she'd been collecting, the way he occasionally redirected her when she headed toward the barn, the sounds she'd hear sometimes in the early evening that weren't the sounds of ranch work, the fact that Tomas had twice arrived before she left and twice been sent on an errand of suspicious convenience. She was curious. She was also, she realized, willing to let him have the mystery. There was something about the fact of a secret that wasn't hidden cruelly but carefully, something that felt like being considered, like someone thinking about you with intention when you weren't there to see it. It was, she thought, one of the stranger forms of intimacy. What she could not avoid, and what came to a head on the second Thursday of December was the gathering of opinion that had been building in Redemption Flat since November. It manifested in the form of a visit from two women, Helen Carlisle, whose husband sat on the town council, and Maud Prescott, who did not occupy any official position but had the unofficial status that comes from 40 years of being the person people went to when they needed something done, who arrived at the Caffrey property on a morning when Eliza was treating a child's winter cough and asked, with careful courtesy, if they might have a word. Frances Caffrey showed them into the sitting room and made herself scarce with the speed of a woman who understood the social dynamic precisely and wanted no part of it. Helen Carlisle had silver hair and a manner that was genuinely kind in its way, not cold, not malicious, but carrying the particular authority of someone who believes their good intentions make their interventions welcome. Maud Prescott was smaller, quieter, and had a way of watching that reminded Eliza of cats watching doors. "We've come because we care about you," Helen began. "I understand," Eliza said. "There are a great many people in this town who value your work. Who value you, Eliza, and we're worried that a situation is developing that could compromise that." She folded her hands in her lap. "Your relationship with Gideon Hale." "We're friends," Eliza said. She kept her voice level. Helen and Maud exchanged a look. The look said, "We are too old and too experienced to accept that at face value, and we think you know that we know that." "You are at his ranch nearly every day," Helen said. "I was treating a significant hand wound. The treatment is ongoing." "For 6 weeks?" Maud said. First word she'd said. Her voice was mild and precise. Eliza looked at her. "Wounds on working hands in cold weather are slow to close completely. You'd know that." Maud's expression didn't change. "I'd know that a normal course of treatment doesn't involve staying past dark." The room was very quiet. The fire in the Caffrey sitting room made its small sounds. "What is it?" Eliza said carefully. "That you'd like me to do?" Helen leaned forward slightly. "We'd like you to think about what you're risking. Your reputation here is something you've built, your father built. The trust people have in you, the access you have to families who need care. All of that is connected to how people see you. If this association becomes something the town can't overlook, then they'll stop trusting me to treat their sick children," Eliza said. "I'm sorry, but yes, that's what we're saying." Eliza sat with that. She didn't dismiss it. That was the thing about these women, about this particular form of pressure. It wasn't wrong, exactly. It was real. The world they were describing was the world that existed, not the world that ought to, but the actual one. And the cost they were naming, the access, the trust, the ability to do the work she'd built her life around, was not a theoretical cost. It was specific and genuine and would fall on real people if it materialized, including people who had nothing to do with her choices. She thought about the child she'd just been treating. She thought about Frances Dole's daughter and the earache. She thought about the 10 families she'd been through difficult nights with who'd sent for her instead of waiting 2 days for Dr. Mercer. Then she thought about Gideon's kitchen, the cleared windowsill, the coffee already on. "I hear what you're saying," she said at last, "and I'm not dismissing it. These are real things you're naming, and I will think about them honestly." She looked at both women. "But I'd ask you to consider something in return." Helen nodded. "Open." "If I were a man my age," Eliza said, "visiting a woman of 56 who happened to be the subject of some talk, would you be sitting in this room with me right now?" The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. Maud Prescott looked at her hands. Helen looked at something slightly to the left of Eliza's face. "That's not a simple comparison," Helen said finally. "No," Eliza agreed. "It isn't, because the rules aren't the same. And I think you both know that the rules aren't the same. And I think, if you're honest with yourselves, you're here partly because the rules say you should be, and partly because you've decided I need protecting from a decision you don't think I've fully considered." She paused. "I've considered it fully, every part of it. I've been awake with it at 3 a.m. I know what it costs." Another silence. Maud Prescott looked up from her hands. Her expression had changed, not much, but Eliza caught it. something almost like assessment. "You're not going to change your mind," Maud said. "No," Eliza said quietly. "I'm not." Maud stood. Helen stood, a beat behind her. The visit was ending. At the door, Maud turned. "He built something," she said. Her voice was almost conversational. "Last week, Tomas mentioned he's been working on something on the south end of the property. Said he's been at it for weeks." She looked at Eliza with the expression of someone placing a card on a table whose game she's understood all along. "I thought you might like to know that." Eliza said nothing, but she held it. She thought about it all afternoon. The next morning, she arrived at the ranch before the sun had finished coming up, which was earlier than usual, and Gideon was already in the yard because he was always in the yard at that hour, because that was how ranchers lived, and when he saw her coming through the gate, he had the look of a man who had not expected her quite this soon and was therefore less prepared than he would have liked. "You're early," he said. "I know." She dismounted. She looked at him steadily. "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer directly." Something moved through his face. Not fear exactly. He wasn't a man who feared much, but a kind of alertness, a bracing. "All right." "The workshop," she said. "What are you building in there?" The alertness shifted into something else, something she couldn't immediately read. "It's not done," he said. "I know it's not done. I wanted to... It was supposed to be finished before I said anything about it." "Gideon?" She looked at him. "Two women came to my house yesterday to tell me I was ruining my life. My sister came before that. The town has formed opinions. Everyone has something to say about what I should and shouldn't be doing." She took a breath. "I would like very much to hear what you have to say. Whatever it is, even if it isn't finished." He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the workshop. He looked back at her. "Come on then," he said. The workshop was on the south side of the barn, a long, low building that had held equipment when Eliza had glimpsed it briefly earlier in the fall. What it held now was something else entirely, and she understood it by degrees as she walked through the door and her eyes adjusted to the interior light. The shelving was new, not rough ranch shelving, but careful, level, fitted work. The kind that took time and intention, the kind you built when you were thinking about what would go on it. It ran along 2 full walls, at heights that made sense for storage and access, with spacing that was not random, but considered. Beneath the east window, a window that had been enlarged at some point in the last few weeks, because she remembered it as smaller, there was a long work table at a height suited for someone who spent hours standing at it. The surface was smooth, the legs were solid. The whole thing had the quality of furniture built to last, not to be replaced. There were hooks near the door, low and accessible, sized for bags and coats. The floor had been swept and laid with a runner of matting that made the stone less cold underfoot. A small stove in the corner, not the heavy kind, but the kind that could heat a workspace without overwhelming it, was already vented through the south wall. She stood in the center of it and turned slowly. Everything in the room made sense. Not the general sense of a room put together decently, but the specific sense of a room built around the requirements of a particular kind of work. Her work, she understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once and made her breath catch. The shelves were for medicines, for supplies, for the organized storage of what she carried in her bag and constantly ran out of space for. The table was for examining, for working, for the task that required a clean surface and good light and room to lay things out properly. The window was for that light. The stove was for warmth during the cold months when she sometimes held a sick child for hours. He'd built her a healing house. She turned around. Gideon was standing just inside the doorway watching her, and his face had the expression she recognized now as the one he wore when he'd done the true thing, and was waiting to find out what it cost. "The shelves on the right," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure about the spacing. If they're wrong, I can adjust them. And the table. Thomas told me what height made sense for a work surface, but if it's wrong..." "It's not wrong," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "There's room for a second chair if you need someone with you for difficult cases. And I thought about a separate entrance, so patients could come in without going through the yard, but that would have meant moving the..." "Gideon," she stopped him. "Stop." He stopped.
She was looking at a shelf near the door where he'd left. She now saw a small cedar box she hadn't noticed when she came in. Plain, handmade, the cedar still pale and fragrant. She walked to it and touched the lid. "What's this?" "Open it," he said. Inside the box was a watch she recognized. Her father's watch, which she'd last seen the day of Martin Rowan's burial, slipped into the pocket of a coat by Eliza's own hands, and then given to the box because she couldn't bear to keep it somewhere she'd see it every day. She had no idea how Gideon had located it. She would find out later it had involved 3 conversations, 1 old minister, and a careful negotiation with the sexton who'd handled the coat in question. She didn't know any of that yet. She knew only that she was holding her father's watch in a room that someone had built for her work, with hands that were shaking slightly, and that the person standing in the doorway had somehow known, not by being told, but by listening, by paying the particular quality of attention that most people could not sustain, that these 2 things together would mean something she didn't have adequate words for. The ring was Catherine's, Gideon said. She looked up. He'd moved, was standing closer, and she saw now what she'd missed when she first opened the box. Beneath the watch, laid in a fold of the cedar's inner lining, a ring, simple gold, thin and worn, with an engraving on the inside she couldn't read from here. Her mother's before her. She would have... I know she would have... He stopped, steadied himself. She would have thought you were exactly right. Eliza closed her hand around the watch. "I'm not going to make a speech," Gideon said. "I know I should probably have something better prepared. Something more..." He made a small gesture that encompassed his general inadequacy in the area of formal declaration, which she found more moving than any speech would have been. "I know what this looks like to the town. I know what it costs you. I know what people are saying, and I know they're going to keep saying it." He looked at her, steady, clear. "But I know what I want, and what I want is to know whether you're willing to build something alongside me. Not for the town, not against it either. Just here, on this land, in whatever form it ends up taking." The workshop was cold and smelled of new wood and cedar, and the light from the enlarged window came in at a specific angle that made everything visible without being harsh. And Eliza Rowan stood in the center of it, holding her dead father's watch, and looking at a man who had built her a room for her work because he'd been listening to her long enough to know what she needed before she'd said it. She was still afraid. She wanted to be honest about that, with herself and eventually with him. The fear was real, was specific, was about time and loss and all the ways a person could be left. She hadn't stopped being afraid of those things in the weeks since the storm. She just stopped letting the fear be the only voice in the room. "I have questions," she said. "Practical ones. About how this works. About what it means for the ranch and for my patients and for the life I've made here." "Good," he said. "I have answers. Some of them. The rest we figure out." "That's not a very satisfying answer." "No," he agreed. "But it's an honest one." She looked at the ring in the box. She looked at the watch in her hand. She looked at the room, at the shelves built at the right height, at the table with the smooth surface and the solid legs, at the window sized for good light. "Yes," she said. It came out quieter than she'd expected. Not small, but simple. The word without decoration, the way the true things came. Gideon Hale let out a breath. Just one. Just slow. The breath of a man who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally put it down somewhere it's going to stay. "All right," he said. His voice was rough with something. "All right," she said back. Outside, the December morning was doing what December mornings did, cold and thin and bright, in the way that happened only when the air was clear enough to show you every edge of everything. A horse moved somewhere in the barn. Somewhere on the north pasture, Tomas was doing the morning's work, and would continue doing it, and the ranch would turn on its ordinary axis. But inside the workshop, in the room built for her hands and her work and the life she was going to make, Eliza Rowan stood with her father's watch in her palm, and a man stood 3 feet away from her who had listened well enough to understand her, and for the first time in 2 years she could feel the full, exact weight of not being alone. The town would talk. The town was already talking and would not stop. Clara would have additional things to say.
Helen Carlyle and Maud Prescott would discuss it at length. The Women's Auxiliary would form and revise its opinion over several weeks. None of that was resolved. None of the difficulty was over. She stood in the room he'd built and felt the difficulty on one side of her and this on the other, and chose, as she had been choosing, she understood now, since the night she'd seen a lantern burning still in the middle of a storm, without waiting for the choosing to be easy. The news reached Redemption Flats the way all significant news did, imprecisely, in pieces, with each piece arriving slightly more distorted than the last. What Martha Healy heard first was that Eliza Rowan had been seen leaving the Hale Ranch at an hour that was not the hour of a professional visit, which was true, and that she had been wearing an expression that was not the expression of a woman conducting medical business, which was also true, and that something had changed between the two of them in a way that was now impossible to mistake for anything other than what it was. This part was truest of all. What Martha told her sister was slightly larger than what she'd heard. What her sister told the Women's Auxiliary was larger still. By the time the information reached the far end of town, it had acquired details that neither Eliza nor Gideon had performed, and implications that would have surprised them both, and the whole compressed mass of it sat in Redemption Flats like weather that hadn't broken yet. Present, pressurized, waiting. Eliza felt it the first time she went into town after the workshop morning. She felt it in the way the conversations around her reorganized themselves slightly when she entered a space, not stopping, not falling silent, but shifting in register the way a room shifts when someone opens a door and changes the air pressure. She bought what she needed at the dry goods counter and said good morning to 3 people who said good morning back, and all of it was perfectly civil and entirely aware of itself in a way that ordinary civility wasn't. She rode home and thought about what Gideon had said. Not for the town, not against it either. She held that and tried to feel its truth, and mostly she did. The mostly was what she had to work with. What she had not anticipated, and what arrived on a gray Tuesday in mid-December like something she should have seen coming but hadn't, was the conversation with Gideon about the wedding itself. He brought it up carefully, in the way he handled things he knew were going to require navigation, by starting somewhere adjacent and moving toward the center by degrees. They were in the kitchen, the stove was going, the coffee was hot, which meant she'd arrived while it was still morning. "I've been thinking about timing," he said. She looked up from her cup. "For what?" "For the wedding." He said it plainly, because that was how he said things. Whether we do it soon or whether we wait until spring, and how either of those things affects what the town is going to make of it. "What are the options?" she said. Not a question, because she already knew the options, but she wanted to hear how he framed them. "Soon, say January. And people say we rushed because we had to. Because there was something that needed covering." He paused. "Spring, and people have spent 4 more months deciding what it means and saying so. And we've spent 4 more months living in this, in between." "The in-between isn't comfortable," she said. "No." He looked at his hands. The right one was fully healed now, the skin closed, a thin pale scar across the palm that she knew better than she knew most things at this point. "But comfortable isn't the main thing I'm deciding by." "What is the main thing?" He looked at her. "What's right for you, specifically? Not for the story the town tells, for you. What you need the time to look like." She thought about this honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about hard things. She thought about the 4 more months of the in-between, of the visits that were both everything and undefined, of the specific daily cost of being almost somewhere without being there. She thought about the workshop with its careful shelves and its good window, and the cedar box sitting on the shelf near the door where Gideon had left it, the ring still inside because she'd put it back carefully when she left, meaning to ask him about it at the right moment, and the right moment had been harder to locate than she'd expected. She thought about January, about the specific weight of deciding in the cold, without ceremony being able to disguise itself as anything other than exactly what it was. "I don't want to wait until spring," she said. "I want to be honest about that. Waiting feels like we're waiting for the town to get used to it, and I don't think we should be doing this on the town's schedule." Something in his face eased. Not dramatically. He wasn't a man of dramatic ease, but she caught it. "All right. But I want it done properly," she said. "Not rushed. Not like something we're ashamed of and trying to get behind us. I want a day that's a day. She paused. I want Clara there. Even though she's going to be difficult about it, I want her there. Of course, he said, and I want the workshop to be finished. She looked at him. Not because I need it to be, but because you started it for a reason, and I want it finished before we start everything else. I want it to be part of what we begin from. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she'd seen before, that particular quality of attention that was both careful and complete. And then he said, "Give me 3 weeks." On the workshop? On everything. 3 weeks to finish the shelves and get the stove properly fitted and sort out whatever else it needs. And to talk to the county clerk. A pause. And to write to Clara. She looked at him. You're going to write to Clara. If that's all right. What are you going to say to her? He was quiet for a moment. I'm going to ask her permission, he said. Not because I need it, but because you love her and she matters to you. And the way a person treats the people who matter to someone they love says something about who they actually are. He held her gaze. I want her to know who I actually am. Eliza set her cup down. That's going to be a very short letter, she said, or a very long one. Probably long, he agreed. I have a lot to account for. She looked at him. This man who had swept his kitchen floor and enlarged a window and spent weeks building shelves at the right height, and had now decided the correct response to an uncertain sister-in-law was a carefully considered letter, asking for permission he didn't technically require, and felt something that was neither dramatic nor particularly speakable, just true and steady and very sure of itself. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks. He wrote the letter to Clara that evening, which was longer than he'd intended, and said more than he'd planned to say, which was probably right. He told her about Catherine, not everything, but enough, the shape of it, the 11 years of knowing how much it mattered to have someone who told you whether you were getting things right. He told her that he understood what he was asking Eliza to walk into, and that he didn't take the cost of it lightly, and that the workshop, which he described in some detail, was not a gift exactly, but an attempt to make the cost into something that served her, that turned what she was giving up in terms of the town's comfortable approval into something she could actually use for the work she'd built her life around. He told Clara that Martin Rowan had been a good man and that he'd known it, and that whatever Martin would have said about this, he hoped it wouldn't have been entirely unfavorable. He sealed the letter and sent it with Tomas on the Wednesday mail run, and then went back to the workshop and worked for 3 hours on the secondary shelving that still needed fitting. Clara's reply came 9 days later. It was 2 pages. The first page was Clara being Clara. Thorough, pointed, not unkind, but not easy either. A list of legitimate concerns rendered in the careful language of a woman who wanted to be heard before she was dismissed. Gideon read it twice and didn't disagree with most of it. The second page was different, shorter. The handwriting had changed slightly, the way handwriting changes when someone stops drafting and starts actually writing. It said, My father had an expression for men he trusted. He called them steady. He didn't use it often. I'm going to choose to believe that you are steady in the way he meant it. If I am wrong, you will hear from me again. If I am right, take care of her in the way she deserves. She deserves more than people usually think to give her. He read that page 4 times. He wrote back that afternoon, a single short paragraph that said only, I know, I intend to. The 3 weeks were not smooth. Nothing in a working ranch in December was smooth. The cold made everything harder. The shortened days compressed the available light, and Tomas came down with something respiratory in the second week that meant Gideon was doing most of the morning work himself while also trying to finish the workshop in the evenings. He was tired in a way that he recognized as the particular tiredness of a man past 50 doing the work of a younger man, and he did not mention this to Eliza because she would have said something practical and useful, and he wasn't ready to be practical and useful about it yet. She noticed anyway. She always noticed. On the 15th day, she arrived to find him at the work table in the workshop, fitting the last section of shelving by lamplight at an hour when he'd usually have been inside, and she stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment without saying anything. You're not sleeping, she said. I'm sleeping fine. You've got that look. He turned around. What look? The look you had when I first came here.
when you were trying to convince yourself the hand was fine. She crossed her arms. You're not going to do your back in trying to finish this before the deadline. I will move the deadline. It's not the deadline, he said. It's almost done. Gideon, 2 more evenings, he said. Maybe 3. He held her gaze. I'm fine. She looked at him for a long time. He knew the look. She was running an assessment, the way she assessed everything, quietly and thoroughly, and usually arriving at conclusions more accurate than most people's deliberate diagnoses. Sit down for 10 minutes, she said. Right now, before you do another joint. Eliza, I'm not negotiating, she said. Not harshly. Just the simple, level statement of a woman who knew what she was asking for and why. Sit down. He sat down. She sat across from him at the new work table in the cold workshop with the lamp between them, and they didn't talk much. She brought tea from the kitchen, which she'd apparently planned in advance because she'd arrived with the makings, and they drank it in the workshop, and she asked him about the water rights dispute that had been dragging through the county office, and he told her about the latest development, which was maddening, and she said 3 things about it that he hadn't thought of, and one of them was genuinely useful, and he told her so. After 10 minutes, she stood up and said, 2 more joints tonight, then you go inside. That's not 2, she said. I'll tell the shelves the rest can wait. He laughed. He hadn't meant to. It came out before he could manage it, and it was a genuine laugh, the kind that surprised him by its existence, and she looked at him when he did it with an expression that was complicated and warm, and that he would think about later. 2 joints, he said. Fine. She stayed while he finished them, sitting on the stool in the corner with her coat around her, and then walked him to the house door and said goodnight in the particular way she said goodnight now, not the professional way of the first 2 weeks, with its careful distance, but the way of someone who means it, who is aware of what the word contains. He went inside. He slept for 7 hours, which was more than he'd managed in a week. The wedding was on the 8th of January. The decision about who to invite had been, unexpectedly, the most difficult part. Not because either of them had a large natural constituency in Redemption Flats right now, the town's opinion being what it was, but because inviting too few people felt like admitting something, like performing the secrecy everyone expected, and inviting too many felt like a provocation neither of them had the energy for. They settled on a middle course that was Eliza's idea and that Gideon agreed to after about 45 seconds of consideration. They would tell people, simply and without ceremony, and let people decide whether to come. No formal invitations, no printed cards. They would tell Tomas, who would tell the people he knew, and they would tell Clara, who would come or not come based on her own decision, and they would tell Dr. Mercer directly because it was the right thing to do, and they would tell Martha Healy because not telling Martha Healy would produce a worse outcome than telling her. And what happened after that would happen. Telling Owen Mercer fell to Gideon, which surprised Eliza when he said he wanted to do it himself. Why you? She asked. Because it should come from me, he said, man to man. Not because of what he might have been to you, that's your business and yours only, but because he's going to see me on this street for the next 20 years, and I'd rather he hears it from me directly than get it secondhand. She thought about that. All right, she said, but I want to know how it goes. You'll know. Gideon found Owen Mercer at his office on a Thursday afternoon, knocked on the door, and when Mercer opened it, said simply, I'd like a few minutes, if you have them. Owen looked at him for a moment and then stepped back to let him in, which told Gideon something about the man, that he had the steadiness to do that, to let in someone he had complicated feelings about without making the complicated feelings the first thing in the room. The office was small and organized in the way of someone who had recently arrived and was still establishing systems. 2 chairs, a desk, the smell of the carbolic solution that Eliza also used, and that Gideon now associated entirely with her. I'm going to marry Eliza Rowan, Gideon said. He said it without preamble because preamble in situations like this was its own kind of unkindness. On the 8th of January, I wanted you to hear it from me. Owen Mercer was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the middle distance, at something slightly past Gideon's left shoulder, and his face had the careful quality of a young man managing something he hadn't fully processed. I see, he said. I'm not asking your approval, Gideon said. I want to be clear about that, but I'm also not,
I don't want there to be bad feeling between us that didn't have to be there. You're this town's doctor. She's going to be working alongside you, treating families out here. That relationship needs to be able to function." Owen looked at him then. "Does she know you're here?" "Yes." A pause. "And she was all right with it?" "She was." Owen was quiet again. Something worked through his face. Not bitterness, Gideon thought, but something more complicated, the processing of a man who had genuinely wanted something and was having to put it somewhere it could live without festering. She's not easy to know," Owen said at last. "She doesn't let people in easily." He paused. "I could never quite get past the professional regard. I kept thinking if I just waited long enough, she'd—" He stopped. "I realize now I was waiting for something that wasn't going to happen, and I think I knew that before I admitted it." "She's exactly what she appears to be," Gideon said. "That's both the difficulty and the thing." Owen looked at him. "You know her well." "Not well enough yet," Gideon said, "but I'm working on it." Something shifted in Owen Mercer's face. Not warmth exactly, but the thing that comes before warmth. A kind of recognition of one person acknowledging that another person is telling the truth. "She deserves someone who works on it," he said. "Yes," Gideon said. "She does." He stood up. Owen stood too, out of habit or courtesy, or both. They shook hands, which was less awkward than either of them had expected and more meaningful than either of them would acknowledge afterward. At the door, Owen said, "I'll come. To the wedding, if it's an open thing." Gideon looked at him. "It's an open thing," he said. "You'd be welcome." Clara arrived on the 6th, 2 days before, which was either grace or strategy, and was probably some of both. She came on the afternoon stage, and Eliza met her at the station, and they stood on the platform for a moment looking at each other, the way sisters look at each other when they've fought and haven't fully resolved it, and both know it, but both also know that some things matter more than the unresolved thing. Clara hugged her first. Eliza held on longer than she usually would. "You look different," Clara said for the second time. The first time in November, it had been an observation that contained an accusation. This time it was just an observation. "Good different or concerning different?" Eliza asked. "You look less held," Clara said, trying to find the word. "Like something you were carrying you've put down." "Yes," Eliza said. "That's about right." They walked to the Caffrey property where Clara would sleep, and Clara asked practical questions about the logistics, and Eliza answered them, and they talked around the real things for about 40 minutes before Clara stopped on the road and said, "Let me see the workshop." They went to the ranch. Gideon was not there. He'd taken the afternoon deliberately, which Eliza had asked him to do and which he'd done without question, understanding it was necessary. Clara walked through the workshop slowly, the way she walked through things she was assessing, looking at the shelves and the table and the window and the stove, touching the surface of the work table with one hand. She was quiet for a long time. "He built this before he asked you," Clara said. Not a question. "Yes." "He built this not knowing what you'd say." "Yes." Clara's hand was still on the table. She looked at the shelves, at the careful spacing, at the window letting in the January light. "Papa used to say that you could tell everything about a man's character by what he made with his hands when no one was watching." She paused. "He said the work a man did privately was the truest thing about him." Eliza said nothing. This is very private work," Clara said. "Yes," Eliza said quietly. "It is." Clara turned around. Her eyes were doing something she was clearly not going to acknowledge if she could help it. "I wrote to him," she said. "Did he tell you?" "He told me he wrote to you. He didn't tell me what you said. I told him he needed to be steady." Clara's voice was careful and controlled, in the way Papa meant steady. "I told him if he wasn't, he'd hear from me. And I think—" Clara stopped, pressed her lips together. "I think he probably is." She looked at her sister. "I don't like the age. I'm not going to pretend I don't think about the age. I'm going to think about the age for years." "I know," Eliza said, "but I don't think he's wrong for you." She said it like it cost her something,
like she'd arrived at it by a long route and wasn't sure she'd have chosen the route if she'd seen it clearly at the start. "I don't think he's wrong for you." Eliza crossed the workshop and put her arms around her sister in the cold, cedar-smelling room, and Clara held on with the firmness of someone who is not going to cry and is succeeding through effort. "Thank you," Eliza said. "Don't thank me," Clara said into her shoulder. "I'm still going to have opinions." "I know." She pulled back and looked at her sister's face. "I'd be suspicious if you didn't. But
The 8th of January arrived cold and bright in the specific way of New Mexico winter mornings. The sky a hard, clear blue that had nothing to do with warmth, the kind of sky that was honest about what it was. The wedding was at the county clerk's office, because that was where it was done, and then outside in the open because the space was too small for the number of people who came. This was the part nobody had predicted. Not Eliza, not Gideon, not Clara, who had prepared herself for an intimate and somewhat embattled occasion, and found instead something that resisted the story she'd written in advance. They came. Not everyone, some people in Redemption Flats had their opinions and meant to keep them, but more than Eliza had counted on, and more than Gideon had let himself expect. Tomas was there, his respiratory ailment resolved, wearing a coat that was clearly his best one. Frances Caffrey came and brought her husband. Two of the families Eliza had treated during difficult nights came, and one of them, a woman named Pearl Dobbs, whose son Eliza had helped through a fever the previous winter, walked up to Eliza before the ceremony and took both her hands and said simply, "You've earned this," and walked away before Eliza could say anything back. Martha Healy came, which surprised everyone and no one, and had the expression of a woman recalibrating a narrative she'd been invested in. She would not admit then or afterward that she'd had it wrong. But she stayed the full morning, which was its own kind of revision. Owen Mercer came and stood at the back and shook Gideon's hand afterward with a sincerity that was visible and that cost him something, and that he paid without making it anyone else's burden. Gideon thanked him for coming and meant it. Owen said he wished them well and also meant it, which was the thing about Owen Mercer. He almost always meant what he said. June Pratt came. This was the one that made Eliza have to work to keep her face composed, because June Pratt, with her crossed arms and her carefully delivered concerns, was the last person she'd expected, and June came in and stood beside Frances Caffrey and watched the whole proceeding, and when it was done, she walked up to Eliza and said, in her weather report voice, "I was wrong about this." Then she walked away. 4 words of revision, blunt and ungarnished, which was exactly the right number of words from exactly the right kind of person. Clara stood beside Eliza through the ceremony, which was short, which Gideon had argued should be short on the grounds that the things that mattered didn't need to be lengthened to prove they mattered. The clerk read what the clerk read. Gideon said what he said, which was not many words but was every one of them true, and Eliza looked at him while he said it and thought, "This is the steadiest person I have ever known, and I am standing next to him, and this is real." She said her part, which she had also kept simple, because simple was what she had available, and she was not willing to perform something she didn't have. The ring had been Catherine's, and then Catherine's mother's before that, and when it went on Eliza's finger, the weight of all of that was something she felt specifically, not as a burden, but as a kind of depth, the sense of a thing that had been passed through time by people who understood what mattered and had agreed this mattered. She thought about her father's watch in the cedar box on the workshop shelf. She thought about Martin Rowan, who would have known what to say in this moment and who was not here to say it. And she felt his absence the way she always felt it, not as a wound anymore, but as a shape, a cleared space that remained and was allowed to remain. Outside, in the cold, bright air, Clara hugged her and said into her ear, "Papa would have had something to say about that man." "Good or bad?" Eliza asked. "Good," Clara said. "Definitely good." She pulled back. Her eyes were doing the thing again. "You know that." "Yes," Eliza said. "I do." Gideon was talking to Tomas about something involving the north fence, because Gideon would talk about the north fence at his own wedding, which was who he was, and she had known who he was and chosen anyway. And he glanced up and found her watching him, and something crossed his face that she recognized because it was the same thing she felt,
The same specific quality of noticing that said, "There you are. That's still you. That hasn't changed." He came across to where she was standing. He stood beside her, not touching, just beside, in the winter sun that was honest about not being warm. "How are you?" he asked. Simple question, the kind that meant something specific between them now. Yes, she said. "I'm good." She paused. "I'm actually good." He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." The gathering, such as it was, lasted until mid-morning and then dispersed the way frontier gatherings dispersed. Gradually, without a clear ending, people peeling off in ones and twos until the group was small and then smaller, and finally just the two of them, and Clara and Tomas, in the thin January sun. Clara announced she needed to start back before noon to make the stage, which was true and also tactful, and Tomas had always understood when his presence was and wasn't required. And within an hour they had gone, and it was just the two of them standing outside the county clerk's office in the clear, cold light of a morning that had turned out to be something other than what anyone had predicted. "Well," Gideon said. "Well," Eliza said. He held out his hand. The right one, the scarred one, the one she'd treated for the better part of a month before either of them would admit to what was actually happening. She took it. They walked back to the ranch in the cold, not saying much, which was the right amount to say. The road was familiar to her now. She'd ridden it so many times in the last 2 months that she knew its specific variations, the place where the ground was softer, the bend where the wind changed direction. She walked it now for the first time as something other than a visitor, and that difference was small in the physical sense and enormous in every other. The workshop was the first place she went when they got back. She went in and looked at the shelves, at the table, at the window that was the right size for the right light. She looked at the cedar box on the shelf near the door. She picked it up and opened it. Her father's watch, and the space where the ring had been. She closed it again and held it for a moment. "I want to put this in the house," she said, when Gideon appeared in the doorway. "Not in here. In the house." "Wherever you want it," he said. She carried it inside and put it on the kitchen windowsill, the clear space where the harness hardware had been. That first morning she'd noticed anything, that small sign of preparation she hadn't known what to call. It sat there in the afternoon light, and she looked at it and felt the rightness of it, the specific rightness of a thing in the place where it belongs. She turned around. Gideon was in the kitchen doorway, and the kitchen was warm because the stove was going, because it was always going now, because warmth was expected now, in a way it hadn't been. "There are things I'm going to get wrong," she said. She meant it as a statement of fact. "I'm not easy. I have opinions, and I'm not always kind about them. I get tired, and I don't always say so, and I've been alone long enough that I've gotten used to making decisions without consulting anyone." "I know," he said. "I'm telling you so. You can't say you weren't warned." "Eliza." He said her name in the way that still had the quality of before he'd decided to. "I've been alive for 56 years. I know that nothing worth having arrives without cost." He met her eyes. "I know what I got." She looked at him. At this man in his kitchen, her kitchen now, their kitchen, with his scarred hand and his rebuilt workshop and his particular quality of being exactly where he said he was, being exactly the thing he appeared to be when you looked closely enough and long enough. "All right," she said. "Good." The afternoon stretched out ahead of them, ordinary, full of the particular unremarkable work of a life. And she thought that this was the thing nobody told you about the moments you'd feared and longed for and waited on. That when they arrived, they turned out not to be a single feeling, but a whole mixture of feelings, some of them complicated and some of them quiet, and some of them just the simple fact of being somewhere you recognized as yours. She made coffee. He went out to check the north fence before dark, because the north fence was always the north fence. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him go, and then turned back to the stove and the ordinary warmth of the room and began. The first months of their marriage were not a honeymoon in any romantic sense of the word. They were January and February in New Mexico territory, which meant frozen water troughs before dawn, a calf born too early in weather that had no business producing calves, In a stretch of 10 days in late January, when the temperature dropped far enough that Eliza spent more time in the workshop managing frostbitten hands from 3 different families than she spent in the house with her husband. This was, she would tell Clara in a letter written in February, more or less exactly what she'd expected. She didn't write that as a complaint. She wrote it as the specific satisfaction of a person whose expectations have been met honestly. What she had not expected, or rather what she'd expected abstractly but not in its particular daily form, was how much of marriage turned out to be the negotiation of small things. Who left the stove door open and let the heat out?
Whose system for organizing the kitchen stores was correct, which was a matter of genuine philosophical difference that took 3 weeks to resolve and was resolved badly, in the sense that they arrived at a compromise neither found fully satisfying. The question of Gideon's tendency to fix things without mentioning they'd been broken, which deprived her of information she felt she was entitled to. The question of Eliza's tendency to work until the lamp oil ran out without registering that she'd been sitting in the dark for 20 minutes, which alarmed him in a way he expressed as irritation because he hadn't quite learned yet to lead with the worry directly. These were not dramatic failures. They were the ordinary friction of 2 people who had each been alone long enough to have calcified slightly around their own habits and now had to soften those calcified places without losing the integrity of the bone beneath. Some days, it was harder than others. One evening in February, they had a real argument. Not a cold disagreement, but an actual argument with raised voices, which surprised both of them partly by its content and partly by the fact that it was happening at all. It was about the Henderson family, who lived 8 miles north and whose youngest daughter Eliza had been treating for a persistent chest ailment that was not improving the way it should. Eliza had told Gideon she intended to ride out there in the morning regardless of the weather, which was forecasting badly, and Gideon had said that was a bad decision and that Owen Mercer was closer to the Hendersons from the North Road, and she should send word to him instead. Owen Mercer has never treated that child, she said. Owen Mercer is a trained physician. So is my judgment, which has been treating that child for 6 weeks. Your judgment is also the thing that's going to ride 8 miles in a storm that... I know what the weather is, Gideon. I've been riding in this territory for 5 years. That's not... He stopped, pressed his hand flat on the table. That's not the argument. The argument is that you matter to me specifically, and I am not comfortable with the risk of this specific ride on this specific morning. She looked at him. Her own voice had been rising, and now she heard it level out against her will, because what he'd just said was not unreasonable, and she knew it. The child matters to me specifically, she said. Her lungs have been worsening for 3 days. Another day is... I don't know what another day is. I'm not willing to find out. The kitchen was quiet. The stove ticked. Then I'll ride with you, he said. You have... Tomas can handle the morning work. His voice was flat and decided in the way it got when he'd made up his mind. I'll ride with you. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the first night she'd ridden to this ranch in a storm, the argument she'd had with herself on Fern's back about why she was going, what qualified it as reasonable. She thought about how little she'd known then about this man, and how much she knew now, and how the knowing complicated the having, because the more you knew, the more you had to actually account for. Fine, she said. We leave at first light. Fine, he said. They rode out in the morning in weather that was bad, but not as bad as the forecast had threatened, which Eliza noted without saying I told you so, because she was not always generous and she was working on it. The Henderson child's chest was worse than the last visit, and Eliza spent 4 hours there adjusting the treatment, showing the mother what to watch for, leaving instructions written in the clear hand her father had insisted she develop because, he'd said, instructions you couldn't read were not instructions at all. Gideon waited. He fixed a broken hinge on the Henderson barn door while he waited, without being asked, because he was the kind of man who could not be idle in a space where something needed doing. He drank coffee with Frank Henderson and talked about cattle prices and the county water dispute and said nothing about why he'd come along, just sat there as if this was simply a morning's errand he'd attached himself to. On the ride back, with the weather having cleared into something almost forgiving, Eliza looked at him on his horse beside her and thought about the hinge, about the fact that he'd fixed the hinge. Thank you, she said, for coming. You're welcome, he said. How's the girl? Better than I feared, not as good as I want. She paused. I'll need to go back in 3 days. All right. You don't have to. I know, he said. I wasn't planning to argue about it. A pause. The weather will be better in 3 days? She looked at him. There was a pull at the corner of his mouth, not quite the ghost of a smile, something more settled than that, something that had become more sure of itself over the weeks. She looked back at the road ahead. You're insufferable, she said. He said. They rode home in the thin February sun, and the Henderson girl recovered fully by the end of the month, which was not guaranteed and not a miracle, just the outcome of consistent treatment applied early enough, which was exactly what it was. But ye irritates. Spring came in March, tentatively at first, the way spring arrives in places where winter is serious, not with warmth, but with the withdrawal of cold, a lessening rather than a positive thing, the ground deciding to release what it had held. By April, the ranch was coming back into itself with the particular energy of land that has been waiting, and Eliza's workshop had its first full season of proper use. She had not anticipated what it would feel like to work from a fixed place. The 5 years since her father died had been a practice of perpetual mobility. Her bag, her horse, the road between other people's houses. She had not had a space that was specifically hers, that was built around the requirements of her work, rather than adapted for it after the fact. The workshop, with its right-height table and its well-spaced shelves and its window that let in the morning light at exactly the useful angle, was something she found herself grateful for in a way that was difficult to articulate because it was about more than the physical convenience of it. It was about being considered, being known well enough that someone could build the room your work required without asking you to describe it. Families came to the workshop now, not just from the immediate area, but from further out. People who had heard, through the particular information network of frontier communities, that there was a place at the Hale Ranch where you could bring a sick child or a wound that needed proper attention and receive the kind of care that didn't require waiting 2 days for the doctor and didn't cost what the doctor cost. Owen Mercer knew about it and had said nothing against it, which was its own form of endorsement. He sent her a patient in April, a woman whose particular ailment he recognized as outside his training and within hers, with a note that said only, "I thought you might have seen this before." "I haven't." She had. She treated it. She sent a note back with her observations, which he read and replied to, and by May they had developed a correspondence about difficult cases that was professional and useful and entirely free of the residue of anything else, which was a thing she was quietly grateful for without making it into a larger thing than it was. The workshop became, gradually and without any formal declaration, the thing it had been built to be. Word moved the way word moved out here, and people found their way to it, and Eliza worked in it on the morning she was there and rode out when she needed to ride out. And the practice of her days had a shape now that it hadn't had before. Not because marriage had constrained it, but because the fixed point of the workshop gave it structure, gave her somewhere to work from rather than always working toward. Gideon watched this with an expression she caught sometimes when he didn't know she was looking, a satisfaction that was almost too private to observe, the expression of someone who had built a thing and is seeing it work exactly as they'd hoped and hadn't fully allowed themselves to believe it would. She told him she'd seen the expression one evening in April. "What expression?" he said. "The one you make when something works the way you planned it." He looked at her with the careful steadiness she knew by now, like she knew her own face. "It's working," he said simply. "It is," she agreed. "Good," he said, and went back to whatever he'd been reading, and she sat with the warmth of that small exchange for a long time, because this was what she'd learned about him and about herself in the months since January, that the important things between them were rarely large. They lived mostly in the small, in the quality of an ordinary evening, in the accumulation of days that were not remarkable individually, but that added up to something she recognized as the best version of what she'd been hoping for without knowing she'd been hoping for it. June arrived with heat and news, and the news was the kind that reorganized everything. Eliza had suspected for 3 weeks before she said anything. She was a woman who dealt in symptoms and their meanings, and she knew what her own body was telling her, and she had sat with the knowledge privately, turning it in the way you turn something delicate, checking all its surfaces before you bring it out into the open where it becomes real in a different way. She told Gideon on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen. She told him plainly, without staging, because that was how she did things. She'd been up early, and he'd been up early, and the coffee was on, and the morning light was doing its specific thing through the east window, and she simply said it. He went very still. Gideon. Yeah. His voice was different. She noted it. Are you all right? He turned from the window to look at her, and his face had the expression she recognized from the workshop morning in December, the one that appeared when he'd said or done something true and was waiting for what it cost. Except the version she saw now had something more in it, something she didn't have a clean word for, a depth that was partly ancient and partly entirely new. I didn't think... He stopped. At my age, I didn't think this was... Another stop. His face was doing something he clearly wasn't fully in control of, which she had never seen before. He was always in control of his face. I hadn't let myself think about this. Are you... She watched him carefully, the way she watched people when she wasn't sure yet what she was seeing. Is this... He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put his arms around her, which also hadn't happened in this particular way before. Not with this specific urgency, this reaching without thinking. He held on and she felt the whole of him in it, and put her arms around him in return, and they stood in the kitchen in the June morning that way for a long moment. I'm going to be an old man, he said into her hair. His voice was rough. When this child... You're going to be their father, she said. That's the relevant thing. He pulled back enough to look at her. His face was still not entirely under management. Are you... How are you? I'm good, she said. I've been sitting with it for 3 weeks and I'm good. I want to know how you are. He looked at her. He looked at the kitchen, the cedar box on the windowsill, the 2 cups on the table, the room that had been silent for too long before she came and now wasn't. He looked out the window at the yard, at the north pasture visible past the barn, at the fence line that had started all of this. He stopped. Tried again. I didn't know I still wanted this, he said finally. I thought I'd put that away. I thought... He shook his head. I'm better than I've been in a long time. That's the truest thing I can say about it. She held his face in her hands for a moment. He let her, which was itself something. This man who held everything so self-contained, who had spent 11 years managing his own grief and his own life and his own damage with the careful privacy of someone who'd learned that needing people was expensive. All right, she said. All right, he said. They wrote to Clara that afternoon. Clara's reply came in 8 days and was a single page this time, short enough that the shortness was itself the message. Not because she'd run out of things to say, but because what she said covered everything. I told you he was steady. I'm glad I was right. I am going to be the most involved aunt in the history of New Mexico territory, and neither of you has any say in this. Eliza read it at the kitchen table and laughed, genuinely and without warning, and Gideon looked up from the mending he was doing and said, Clara? Clara, she confirmed. The baby came in December, almost exactly 1 year after the workshop morning, which was not a symmetry either of them had planned, but which felt, afterward, like the kind of thing you couldn't have arranged if you'd tried. The birth was hard. Eliza, who knew what hard meant in the context of labor, had still not fully prepared herself for knowing it from the inside rather than the outside. And there was a period in the small hours when it was genuinely difficult in the way that nothing in the prior months had been. Owen Mercer was there, which Eliza had arranged herself, because she was a practical woman, and she understood the difference between pride and good sense. Owen worked with quiet competence and without any of the things between them mattering in the room that night, because the room that night had only one thing that mattered, and they both understood that. Gideon waited in the kitchen. He stoked the stove and he did not pace because pacing was not something he did, but he sat with a stillness that Tomas, who had driven Owen from town and was now sitting in the yard in the cold because he hadn't wanted to leave, would describe afterward as the stillness of a man engaged in the most concentrated form of hoping. The baby was born just before 4 in the morning, and she was loud about it immediately. which Owen said was an excellent sign and which made the sound of the kitchen chair move in a way that suggested Gideon had stood up very fast. When Eliza held her for the first time in the lamplight of the December bedroom, she thought, "Here you are." Just that. The simplest possible recognition, the oldest one, the one that doesn't need improvement. She heard Gideon step in the hall. She heard him stop at the door. "Come in," she said. He came in. He looked at the two of them and did not say anything for a long moment, and she did not require him to, because some things are complete without language, and this was one of them. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his daughter, small and red-faced and aggressively present in the way of new people. And something in his face went entirely open in a way she'd seen only a handful of times, and each time had felt like a privilege. "She's got your determination already," he said. His voice was not steady. He wasn't trying to make it steady. "She's going to give us trouble," Eliza agreed. "Good," he said. Owen Mercer left before light, quietly, with the discretion of a man who understood that what was in the house now needed space. He shook Gideon's hand at the door and said, "She's remarkable," meaning Eliza, meaning the birth, meaning the whole of it. And Gideon said, "I know. I've known for a while." And Owen nodded once, the nod of a man who has fully arrived at a peace with something and is no longer managing it, just living past it. Tomas, when he heard the news from the yard, took off his hat and held it in front of him and said, "Well, Mr. Hale," which contained more in 3 words than most speeches managed in 30. They named her Alice, not for anyone specific, or rather for the accumulated feeling of everyone specific, which is how names sometimes work when you let them. The following October, Gideon walked the north fence, not to repair it, not because it needed anything. He walked it the way he occasionally walked it now, in the early mornings when the light was at its most specific, and the ranch had the particular quality of a place that has been worked and loved for a long time. He walked to the 3rd post from the creek bend, the one he'd tried to fix in the storm 2 years ago, the one whose failure had opened his hand and changed the direction of the next year of his life. The post was solid. He'd reset it properly the following spring, Tomas helping, the ground dry enough to do it right. It would hold for years. He stood at the fence line and looked back toward the house, which from this distance showed the kitchen window, yellow with morning light, and the corner of the workshop roof, and the thin thread of smoke from the stove that meant the house was warm. He could not see Eliza from here. He knew she was in the kitchen with Alice, who at 10 months had opinions about everything and expressed them with the volume and persistence of someone who had decided early that silence was not a working strategy. He stood at the fence and thought about the night of the storm. He thought about what a man could and couldn't see about his own life when he was standing in the middle of it. He'd stood at this post in the rain and thought he was managing, thought that the thing he'd built around himself after Catherine's death was sufficient, was the right size for the life he had left. He'd thought the silence of the house was something he'd made peace with when it was actually just something he'd stopped fighting. He'd been wrong. He'd been wrong in the specific way that people are wrong when they've confused adaptation with contentment, when they've learned to not feel something so thoroughly that they've mistaken the absence of pain for the presence of enough. The storm had torn that open, not the injury. The injury was just the mechanism. What the storm had actually done was put a lantern in the dark at an hour when a particular woman was awake and looking out her window, and that woman had the specific quality of someone who noticed things that were wrong and went toward them rather than away. That was the thing. That was the whole hinge of it. He thought about what it would have cost him to not be found, to have managed the wound himself poorly, to have gone on in the silence of the house for another year and another year after that, not dying exactly, but not fully living either. He was 58 years old, and he had a daughter who shouted her opinions at breakfast, and a wife who would ride 8 miles in uncertain weather because a child's lungs needed attention, and a workshop visible from where he stood that had become the thing it was built to be. He was not a man who believed in luck in any clean sense. He believed in work, in the accumulation of decisions, in the way character either prepared you for things or didn't. But he also believed, and this was something he'd arrived at without ceremony, just by living past 50, That there were moments in a life where the ground shifted beneath you, and everything that came after was different from everything that came before, and that recognizing those moments, being willing to walk toward them instead of explaining them away, was not a small thing. He'd almost explained this away. He'd almost, in the first days, in the first weeks, in the specific gravity of the town's opinion and his own sense of what was reasonable to want at his age, he'd almost convinced himself that what was happening was an indulgence, that a man like him had no business wanting what he wanted. The north fence stood solid in the October morning, and he thought, what a waste that would have been. He turned back toward the house. Well, Eliza was at the work table in the workshop when he came back, which meant she'd settled Alice in the house first, which meant Alice had finally cooperated with being put down, which was not guaranteed. She was sorting supplies, making the notes she kept about what needed restocking, doing the ordinary administrative work of a practice that had grown steadily over the past year and a half into something real. She heard him come in and said, without looking up, "The Henderson girl's mother sent word. Ada's cough is back. Do you need to go today? Tomorrow will do." She looked up. "You walked the fence." He looked at her. She always knew, and he'd stopped asking how. "Yeah." She put her pen down. She looked at him with the full attention she gave to things she was assessing, things she wanted to understand accurately. "Are you all right?" "Better than I've been in a long time," he said, which was what he'd said in June of the year before, in the kitchen, when she told him about Alice. It was still the truest thing. Her face did the thing it did when he said the right thing. Not a large thing, just a settling, a slight easing, the expression of someone whose question has been answered with enough honesty that no follow-up is required. She picked up her pen. Alice, in the house, made a sound that was either contentment or the preliminary stages of an opinion, and they both heard it and both remained where they were, gauging, and then it resolved into contentment, and they both relaxed, and there was something almost like laughter between them without either of them actually laughing. "She's going to run this ranch," Eliza said. "I know," he said. "I'm trying to decide if that's a problem." "It's absolutely a problem," she said. "We're just going to have it anyway." He stayed in the workshop while she worked, which he sometimes did, occupying himself with the minor maintenance tasks that accumulated in any well-used space, a hinge that had stiffened, a shelf bracket that had worked loose. He did not talk while she worked. He'd understood early that she worked best in a particular kind of quiet that was not absence but presence, that what she needed was someone in the room, not someone performing interest in what she was doing. He could give her that. It turned out to be one of the things he was specifically suited to give, and he'd learned to receive it as information about himself rather than instruction. There were things she gave him that he was still learning to name. The directness, the specific, sometimes uncomfortable directness of a person who had decided that the truth was more efficient than the alternatives. The way she argued, which was never to wound but to resolve, to actually get to the bottom of the disagreement rather than to win the surface of it. The way she held his daughter, which he found himself watching with a quality of attention that had nothing to do with worry and everything to do with the fact that it was worth watching. She had been right that she was not easy. She had told him she wasn't easy on the morning of their wedding, and he had understood it theoretically and had learned it practically over the months since. She was exacting, she was particular, she was impatient with things she considered insufficient, and she was sometimes not kind when she was tired in the way she'd predicted. She'd been wrong about one thing only, which was that she'd suggested she didn't always know how to say when she was struggling, and in practice she was better at this than she'd given herself credit for. Not perfect. Nobody was perfect at it, but better. She said things like, "I'm tired and I need an hour of quiet," which was so straightforward that he'd spent the first month being surprised by it because straightforward people were rarer than they should be. He loved her. He thought this without drama, standing at a slightly stiff hinge in a workshop that smelled of cedar and carbolic solution and the particular dry warmth of a stove working properly. He thought it the way he thought about the fence being solid, not as a conclusion, but as a fact, an ongoing, stable, dependable thing that would require maintenance and would hold. This was what he'd stopped believing he had coming, not happiness as a permanent state, He was old enough to know that was not a real thing. But this, a day with useful work in it, and someone present in the useful work, and the sound of a child in the house that was not silence. Redemption Flats changed around them in the way that small places change. Slowly, in aggregate, the sum of many small revisions that no individual would claim as a shift, but that constituted one nonetheless. It was not a transformation. Nobody reformed their deepest opinions in a season or two. Martha Healy continued to be Martha Healy, and June Pratt continued to be June Pratt. And there were people in the town who would always have a version of the story they preferred over the real one, who would always see Eliza's marriage as an eccentricity or an error, even as the evidence accumulated to the contrary. But the workshop changed the practical reality of things, and practical reality has a way of adjusting opinion over time, even when opinion resists adjusting. The families who'd come to the workshop and received competent, careful treatment came back and brought other families. The children who'd been treated there grew up, and their parents had a direct experience to weigh against the gossip, and direct experience is harder to dismiss. Owen Mercer's professional regard, expressed in the correspondence they maintained, in the occasional referral, in the quiet way he mentioned her name when patients needed something he couldn't provide, conferred a legitimacy that the town understood and respected. Claire came twice in the first year and 3 times in the second, which was more than practical and less than she would have liked, and spent portions of each visit being the most involved aunt in the history of New Mexico territory, as she had promised. She and Gideon had arrived at an understanding that was not simple and was not warm exactly, but was genuine, which was better than warm in some ways because genuine lasted without effort. He respected her intelligence and told her so directly, which she hadn't expected and which she'd filed carefully in the same place she'd filed his letter asking permission. The ranch prospered in the plain sense of a working ranch that is worked well. Tomas stayed, and a second hand named Robert joined in the spring of the second year, and the north herd expanded in the way herds expand when the pasture management is sound. These were not dramatic facts. They were the facts of a place that was functioning, that had enough in it to sustain itself and occasionally more than enough. None of it was the life Eliza had been able to picture in advance. That was the thing she returned to sometimes, in the quiet moments, in the early mornings before Alice was awake. She had stood in her small house on the Caffrey property and tried to see her life ahead of her and seen something correct and airless, a life that made sense in every dimension except the one where she actually lived inside it. She could not have pictured this. She could not have built this in her imagination from the materials she'd had available to her then. What she knew now, having lived past the fear and the town's opinion and her own calculations about grief and time, was that the life you couldn't picture in advance was not necessarily the one you shouldn't have. Sometimes it was the only one that actually fit. And sometimes, not always, not reliably, not as a promise you could make to anyone, the storm that seems like the worst thing is just the thing that moves the ground and shifts the post and puts a lantern in the dark at the right hour for the right person to see it. She did not say this to anyone in particular. It was not a lesson she offered. She was not built for offering lessons. Her father had been, and she'd learned from watching him that wisdom was most useful when it was demonstrated rather than declared. But she thought it sometimes, standing at the workshop window in the morning with the early light coming in at the right angle, listening to the sound of the ranch coming awake around her, Gideon's step in the yard, Alice's voice beginning its first argument of the day with the general conditions of the world, the ordinary sounds of a life that was hers. She thought, this is what I would not have found if I'd been less afraid and therefore more careful. She thought, some things require the storm. She picked up her pen, and the morning opened, and she began.